Business models become really important, assuming you do have a customer or a user or somebody who sees value in it, because it helps you figure out how you're going to make money. There were many search engines out there, but Google got a business model that actually made it very successful. Grameen phone. People familiar with that? Grameen? This is phones in rural villages in Bangladesh. And there was no doubt that there was a need for telecommunications there for those villagers to do things. The question is, how would you ever get it there? And the model was using microfinance with empowering village women, primarily women, who would buy the phone, financed through a microloan, and then rent time out on the phone to other people in the village. So that would never have been really successful unless the business model about how we were going to get the service out there and paid was put in place. So it's not always about a straightforward commercial type thing. It can be a lot broader type of application. So tonight we're going to start off with Rich Kivel. Rich has been one of these longtime contributors to Nuts and Bolts. I'm tripling his salary this year, and he still won't have to pay income tax. And Rich has been a serial entrepreneur in everything from information technology when I first met him, moving into biotech, diagnostics, and pharma. And he's got a good, strong background that you can see on the website on his bio. And I'm just going to ask him to come up and take it away. Thanks, Rich.
Great. Thank you, Joe. It's great to be back here. This is a fun class. One of the best parts about this class is that it continually evolves, because every year as we see new companies, new technologies, new industries forming, changing, morphing, merging, the business models that worked for a particular industry 4 or 5 or 6 years ago may not even work any longer today. And because these models change so rapidly, it's important for these companies to adapt quickly to that change. A lot of people use the term pivot. A lot of people just simply consider it reinvention in the company. Entrepreneurship really leads that effort. So what I'm going to talk about today is really the business models that are fundamentally existing today, and also how those have changed. And I'm going to use some examples that you're all familiar with, and some maybe dating back to that you're not familiar with, to give you a foundation as to sort of how these things morph over time. And as Joe said, throughout my career, I've worked in a few different industries. So I started my career in technology, systems and networks, internet-based technologies, and primarily large data centers with a couple of companies in that field. And then in 2001, I moved into the biotech arena with a company called Theragenetics and Molecularware. Molecularware was an MIT spinout. Came out of the MIT, back then the MIT 50K competition. And it was a company that built software applications for scientists and researchers to capture data off of instruments. And then I did other work in the area of diagnostics in the UK, and then now in the area of vaccines and elsewhere. And I've also spent the past year and a half working in the investment sector with Bridgewater Associates, which is on the hedge fund side. So as I look back and reflect on each of those different industries, and the various products within those industries, it is a tremendous array of ways we touched the customer, ways that we identified customers, sold products or services to those customers, and actually brought returns to the investors, and really redeveloped business models as we moved along and as our industries changed. So just to go through this, it's good to start with the foundation, and I think Peter Drucker's a great foundation. He said business models, in a very simplified way, a business model is nothing else than a representation of how an organization makes or intends to make money. Very simple way to look at it. And that really is the foundation of why you need a business model, to drive value, create revenue. And it really describes the rationale of how an organization creates, delivers, and captures value. And the value could be in products or services, or it could be in other ways as well. Complex business models often are what people most are creating when they first think about their business. And then they realize that all we really want to do is we just want to get from point A to point Z. I don't really want to create a complex model. I want to know that I'm sitting on this side, we're creating value, and I'm bringing the product or service to the customer on this side. So complexity is not as important as a well thought out design model. So when you think about organizations building quality business models, you have to remember that the business model is just simply a means to an end. It is not your business. A business model is a way to improve the way you attract customers, identify customers, drive markets, build profitability. So eliminate the idea of complex, very academic business models and think to yourself, if my company, if it's an app development company, software company, medical device, diagnostics company, you're building a new instrument for the telecommunications sector, a new storage device, think about who is going to be the end user and what are the ways I'm going to get my product in the hand of the end user with the least amount of complexity. Because complexity is often the greatest drain on profitability. The more middlemen, the more complexity built into the system itself, the less profit ultimately will flow back up to the company. So we'll talk about a few of those examples. So foundationally, from a standpoint of just what are the pieces of a business model? How should you think about it? As you were all thinking about building your first company or joining a company, you think about, well, what pieces do I have to put in place in order to drive profitability or ultimately drive shareholder value for my company? There's lots of ways to look at this, but I found that these 7 really capture it. And we'll talk about these in more detail, but you have to think about each of these and what are the various components that you're bringing to the table. Number 1 is really the value proposition. So when I think about value proposition, it's really a description of the customer's problem. We're building this particular device. It could be this little laser pointer here. What is the identifiable problem that exists that the customer is going to solve by the use of my device? It's not about the technology. And being at MIT, sometimes it's hard to get away from the technology for a moment. And the whiz-bang technology sometimes is what's so captivating and interesting in the beginning. But at the end of the day, someone's got to pay for this thing. Somebody's got to say, this solved my problem, and I'm willing to actually buy this product. So what is the value proposition? If you have a clearly articulated value proposition that you can say it, as you know, Joe was talking about the elevator pitches. If in that moment, in a minute, you can describe, this is the product, and this is the value that the customer is going to gain from this product. And it might be the product or service reduces cost, it allows them to operate faster, it allows them to do things that they couldn't do before or do the same things better. That value proposition must ring true or the product will not move. Market segments are also a very big piece of this, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail in a moment, but when you think about who you're selling to, some of the examples that I use in this presentation are very specific examples that all of us are familiar with, but companies in the same industry sector took wildly different approaches. So think about companies that are selling clothing, companies that are selling other products or services that are often sold at a retail level. They're selling the things that we buy every day, but some do it in wildly different ways. People can buy clothes that are incredibly expensive or very, very cheap. They both essentially do the same thing. You think about electronics, exactly the same concept. I could buy a very low-end computer, I could buy a very high-end computer. I could buy a stereo system off the shelf at Sears, or I could go to Harman Kardon into one of their beautiful stores, and I could buy a stereo system for tens of thousands of dollars. They both are producing sound and music, but they're doing it in wildly different ways. So these companies are in the same industry sector, but what they did is they decided to segment their audience and then begin to build their business model to attract the most customers for that particular segment. Some of the other ones on this list are the value chain structure. I won't spend a lot of time on this today, but essentially thinking about where you are in the value chain. Remember the slide I put up just a few minutes ago with the sort of crazy complex business model? And then you have the simplification of that. The value chain itself has to be relatively simple. It's where do you fit within that value chain? What are the activities within the chain? And how will your firm capture the value within that? So as an example, if you take any particular product or service, you could take the seats that you're sitting on in this room. If you're the manufacturer of those seats, you have to think, where do we fit within the value chain? Are we going to be the people that are also running all of the sales and marketing? Or are we going to be selling through a distribution channel? Where in the value chain do we best operate? Should we build the entire product from end to end, from the design to understanding the ergonomics, to the wood, the plastic, all of the other fibers and products that are built in it, as well as the framing? Or are we going to specialize in a particular area and become that part of the value chain and become the deepest, the best? So understanding where your product fits within that value chain is absolutely critical piece to identifying whether you're going to succeed or not, and it also helps you understand the competitive landscape in a much better way. If you think about automobiles, are probably one of the great examples of an incredibly complex product that has so many different parts. You've got products that are built into cars now that are coming from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different distributors and manufacturers, designers, et cetera. Nobody really does it end to end. Very few companies do it end to end. So they figure out where they are in the value chain and they make their decision. And then, of course, they're positioning within that, so identifying where you can have the most impact on the market. So now, to talk, getting a little bit closer to the revenue side of the equation. Revenue generation and margins drive business valuation in many industries. Not always the case. We all know companies that have had very limited revenues and virtually no profits and have been acquired for very large sums. So putting that aside, when you're thinking about building a business and actually driving revenue through customer acquisition of products, you have to think about, how is the revenue going to be generated? Is it going to be sales, leasing, subscription, support? Is it going to be the freemium model? How are you going to ultimately generate? So if I give you that application for free that you downloaded to your iPhone, I still need to pay the developer that wrote it. So now I'm going to put in place a business model that says that I'm going to have advertising revenue. That advertising revenue is going to flow back to the company, and I'm going to be able to pay my developers and create value. Or you're buying an application for $1 or $1.99 off the App Store. That's my business model. And there may even be a business model behind the business model. A lot of companies, they're able to give away a product or a service for free, but what they're capturing from you is your data. So they're getting information about you as a retail customer. That data turns out to be worth a lot more than the 99 cents you would have paid for the application. So you give them permission to capture your data, and in return for permission to capture your data, they're able to then give you the application that you wanted. And they then generate revenue by repurposing, reselling, and reusing that data in different ways. So how the revenue is generated is critical. It's not as black and white as I simply take a product, I sell it to a customer. And cost structure and profit margin structure, I think Charlie's going to really talk more about those things and show how those things impact how an organization is ultimately valued. The competitive strategy, of course, is critical. How will a company attempt to sustainably compete within a marketplace, knowing that the market's changed so dynamically, and how will it use that advantage to improve their competitive position? Many of us can recall there are organizations and dozens of companies that at one point were incredibly successful, and they evaporated. They went away, or they lost their position in the market. So think for a moment. In fact, if you could share with me, anybody here could think of a company, an organization, a product that at one point was the high flyer and is now no more. Who is it?
Eastman Kodak.
Eastman Kodak. Deck.
Blockbuster.
Blockbuster. There's a great one, right?
BlackBerry. Nokia.
Nokia. Well, they'll argue with you on that one, right? BlackBerry. Kodak. So many of these companies, in fact, thinking about Blockbuster as a great example, I mean, many of us remember going into the Blockbuster, you get your videos. It was the most logical thing in the world. You went, you rented the video. You didn't want to own it. As long as you returned it on time, it cost less than buying it, unless you got the penalty for returning it that next morning too late. And then ultimately, Netflix came into play. The fact that Netflix figured it out in such a simple way, they simply created a business model that said, People can go online, they can figure out what movie they want. I'm going to stick just the little DVD into an envelope, and I'm going to ship it to them. They're going to get it in a day or two. They put distribution channels in different parts of the country, which guaranteed very, very, very quick response. And that put them in a position where they became the market-dominating player. You didn't have to rush. You can keep the video for a day, a week, a month. You bought your subscription based on the number of videos you could have at any given time. And it allowed you to enjoy that experience in a much better way than you did before, where you were in a rush for that 1 or 2 day rental to bring it back. It also allowed them to touch millions and millions of customers that Blockbuster was not able to touch, because there wasn't a Blockbuster on every corner. So if you're in many parts of the country, there might not have been a Blockbuster for 10 miles. So as you're sitting there thinking about you're home with the kids this weekend, I want to rent a couple of videos. Well, driving a Blockbuster with a car full of kids in a snowstorm might not be the best thing to do on a Friday. But if you thought about that a day earlier, you order from Netflix, your 3 videos show up. So it was instant gratification. It was a fantastic way of essentially shifting the industry so much from the Blockbuster-dominated video store model to very quick, online, decide what you want, it shows up at your house. And now, what's shifted again? How many people are using Netflix now? A lot less. And it's going down pretty dramatically because of the streaming videos. We have that instant gratification that we're able to go online now. The cable companies, who have been some of the slowest ever change the way they operate, have caught on to that. So all of us have a cable box, and you can do the on-demand cable. So you think about, it seems like Blockbuster, it is literally the horse and buggy compared to where we are today. And in the middle of that was a different business model, no new technology. They used the US Postal Service. They used DVDs that had been in circulation for years. And they used very, very sophisticated chain, what would you call it, essentially fulfillment processing. And that allowed them to dominate for a period of time. So that's some examples around competitive strategy and how you're going to use that to improve. And many of these companies, they do fall asleep at the wheel. You guys gave some other examples around Kodak and some others that have just not changed. So when I think about the different customer segments, I want to drive a little bit into this. Because when you think about market segments, there's lots of ways to think about a segment of a market, but you can't be all things to all people. So as you think about your particular product, and we can use any one of the companies you guys mentioned earlier, think about what market segment were they targeting, and were they most efficiently targeting that market? So I broke down a few of them here. So mass market, the niche market, segmented market, or diversified. There's lots of ways of thinking about this. But just picking 2 of these, if you thought about mass market versus niche, Levi's is mass market. The Gap, mass market. What are things that would qualify as niche? Same industry in the retail sector. What are some of the niche players that you think about in that industry? Right? So you think about in the shoe industry, right? Nike, very, very mass market, or Reebok. You can think about some of the very high-end European brands. Say again? What's that one?
Niche, extremely profitable.
I mean, women's shoes is probably one of the great examples of this, right? So you've got these mass market shoe manufacturers and companies. And then you've got, the Jimmy Choos, and you've got these high-end, very expensive niche market shoes. Those companies made a very strategic decision that they were going after particular customer segments that not only drove the type of product they built, how the product was manufactured, where it was manufactured, how it was displayed, how it was sold, what it was priced at. It drove everything about them. But as soon as a company starts to complicate things and become all things to all markets, it gets really, really messy. Can you guys think of any example of a company that tried to do both high-end and low-end and perhaps didn't do it so well? Yeah. It's a good example of a company that tried to service all particular ends of the market, right? Cadillac tried to do that for a period of time, thinking about automobiles. Cadillac at one point was considered that premier car, like all of our grandfathers had one. And it was that car with the leather seats, and it had all the great bells and whistles. And they tried to target every part of the market. They came out with the pickup truck Cadillac. They came out with the SUV. They came out with the little car. And it really it forced them to struggle for quite a period of time as they sort of rebranded themselves. What's another example?
Nordstrom did that recently. They tried to do a big Christmas display at Target this year, and it bombed.
It bombed, did it?
Yeah.
And it's not their market, right? It's just, you think about it, you're not looking for, at Nordstrom, that the target is going to be the customer shopping at Target. They're shopping at Target because they're looking for a particular type of product at a particular price, versus you have a much less price-sensitive target customer segment at the Nordstrom store. Any other examples of companies that totally failed to make that shift or did it in a really sort of wacky way?
Quick example, and also a question. The
Yep.
example I have is Kemper Snowboards, who were extremely early on in the snowboarding market, but then went low end and high end simultaneously and lost to Burton. But the thing I want to ask is, do you find that it's more often companies that are starting out relatively high end that then go for the mass market and cause brand dilution, or is it more often failing due to someone already having a good chunk of the mass market and then trying to go high end and failing?
You know, I don't know the answer to that from a standpoint of, you know, statistically, is there more that fail going down versus going up? But you could come up with some great case studies in both, right? And you can also come up with some great case studies of groups that have done it really, really well. So, I mean, a good example would be, think about Toyota. What did Toyota do when they wanted to attack the higher end market? What did they do? What did they create?
Lexus.
They created Lexus, right? Because they knew that the average college student or, you know, recent college grad buying a $17,000 Toyota is going to grow up someday, and they're going to make more money, and they might be ready for that $40,000 or $50,000 or $60,000 car, but they're not going to drive it as a Toyota logo on it. So they created Lexus. Who else did this in the automobile industry? VW? What did Nissan create? Think about it, just the difference. Many of these are manufactured in the same factories. Most of the parts are manufactured in the same places. But they were able to create some brand loyalty. On the retail side, a good example is Ralph Lauren, probably one of the most successful designers and retailers in the world. What he realized was that he wanted to attack the main part of America in order to get his base. And he did that with basic, generally reasonably priced jeans, shirts, polo wear. And then he realized that he was becoming really limited within that marketplace, and he created a series of other brands. He created Polo Sport on the lower end. He created more suits and things of that nature, and he created a product called Lauren. If you go to many retailers, you'll see a suit, and also women's clothes now, called Lauren. And then he created what's called Purple Label, which is like a $1,500 suit. So he's got the entire sector covered. So you can buy a $1,500 suit designed by Ralph Lauren called Lauren. You could buy like a $600 suit called the Purple brand. You've got the Lauren brand, you've got the Ralph Lauren brand, and then you've got Polo Sport. He did this in a really elegant way by rebranding each of these. He put independent heads in charge of each of these groups. He put experts within that market segment in charge of each of those groups. And just did a fantastic job of rethinking about it. Any other examples or any other good case studies you could think of there? Companies that succeeded or failed in going up or down the market chain. So let me move along a little bit. So different models to evaluate. So when we talked about a few of these companies thus far, what we talked about is not only their products, but one of the things that was sort of overarching in my message was that they're actually targeting the end customer in different ways. And there's lots of ways to do this, right? So we've talked about retail, whether it be clothing or automobiles. We've talked a little bit about electronics. It could be apps or music or other things that are downloadable. So to think about what is the way that you're going to use the model, the business model that you've chosen, to actually get to the end user. And there's lots of ways to do that. Here's a few examples. So to talk about a few of these and sort of call them out, I'm going to just pull out a few of these so we don't go through them all, but just please raise a hand if there's one in here that I didn't cover, you want me to go a little bit deeper. Direct sales is the one that I think most people are familiar with, especially when it comes to products that are often sold directly to businesses. Most products, if you're building a software application or a product, it's very often when you're selling to a business or a company, it's sold through a direct sales force. If you're going to sell laptop computers to a company, they're not going to buy 250 laptops online. Chances are they're going to do it with a local representative from Dell or from another organization. If you're selling the furniture that's in this room, MIT's not going to buy that without a super high-touch relationship with a direct salesperson. Think about in the medical device industry. If I'm selling a new medical device, that needs to be sold to the clinician. The clinician needs to be absolutely part of that sales process, understand how it's going to operate, why it's better than the last catheter or the last stent or the last implantable device than they were using before. He's going to want or she's going to want to know what are all of the research, the white papers, the FDA's position on that. That is really, really intensive sales. This is not a decision they make by looking at a catalog or going on the internet. That relationship is absolutely critical. So direct sales is a very valuable way of getting to the end user. So there's a lot of positives to this. It's high contact, great customer relations. You have lots of control over who's going to be ultimately using that product. One of my first, Molecularware was probably a good example of this. This was the MIT spin-out that created software applications for researchers and scientists. Well, this is also in 2001, 2002. Nobody was downloading large applications like this. So we needed a very physical contact, a very strong contact with our end user. And we needed people that would walk into the end user, the scientist, the researcher, the acquirer of products for a particular lab, and also show them how to use it. So there was this tremendous control we had over the message, how the product was used, and we also were viewed as experts in the field. So there's a great value to having a direct sales force. Another way to look at direct sales force is that they're very, very expensive. You very often are providing free advice and free consulting to your customer. So as you're sitting there, you're not only educating that potential customer on why your computer or your software or your instrument is the best, but you're also educating them about the market. So when they meet with 3 sales reps from other companies, they're much more informed. And you have to sort of take that and recognize that there's a value to that. It's part of the high cost of a direct sales force. Another mechanism to get your products, if you said, I don't want to sell directly to the consumer, I'm going to actually use channel sales. So many of you have heard of distribution or channels, or I think even OEM is another way of thinking about this. If you take a look at, I see many of you guys with laptops, if you took the average computer, it's got parts coming from dozens and dozens of manufacturers, and the software built into that computer is also arriving from other manufacturers. So anybody, if you have a PC, very often when you open up the PC, you look at the screen, what does it say on these little, not the screen, excuse me, right by the keyboard, there's usually a couple stickers there. What do those stickers usually say? Intel inside. So what you see there is a company, Intel, made a decision. They were not going to sell directly to the end user in this case. They were not going to sell retail. What they were going to do is they were going to use a distribution channel, in this case called OEM, which is through the original equipment manufacturer. They were going to create a partnership with the manufacturers of laptops. The laptop manufacturer is solely responsible for the sale of the product through the sale of that particular computer. We did the same thing at Molecularware because we didn't have the financial resources to build a big sales force. But our software was being used by people that were using instruments to use, basically to evaluate both genetic, genomic, proteomic data. And because that instrument connection to our software was so critical, what we did is we partnered with the instrument companies. So a good example is we had a company called Applied Precision up in Issaquah, Washington, that was selling one of the best imaging scanners in the world to look at genetic data, to look at proteomic data as well. And they were using pretty crappy software that I think their people made internally. We were able to go in, work with them to understand how our software was able to communicate with their instrument and provide a better readout, easier to use for the end user. Through that OEM channel, we were able to sell software to dozens and dozens of labs and researchers that we never had to visit. We didn't have to put a salesperson in there. I didn't have to train anybody. I didn't have to hire someone. I didn't have to go there and fix the problem. It went one relationship with an OEM channel, that became an international distribution through their particular product. So it's another example there. Yep.
On that particular case, yesterday, Bob really emphasized being close to the customer. In this case, you've got a bit of confusion. Who is the customer? Is it the end user, or is it your channel? And
It's a really good question.
can you speak a little bit about that? Because many of the ideas that people are bubbling up with have this sort of disconnect. They'd like to talk to end customers, and yet they need to sell through others.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's one of these challenges that you face as an early stage company because your message is not clear yet to the market. The market doesn't actually know who you are yet. So it sometimes can create a little bit of a concern at the end user side if they're buying this particular product and this product is coming with a sticker on it that says powered by a company I never heard of or software by somebody I didn't know. So you do run into a challenge there where that relationship and getting very close to the customer is important. Well, what you need to do for a small company that's unable to work on decades of branding and so forth is you need to make sure that the OEM partner, similar to the third-party distribution partners we'll talk about, that partner understands your messaging in a very, very high-quality way. They essentially are the voice of your company, but they're not on your payroll. And it's really critical to make sure that you have the right partner. The wrong partner can destroy you within the marketplace because they're giving the information to the client that's not accurate. The client winds up buying the product. They have the software doesn't work the way they expected it, or they weren't trained on it the way they expected it, and it has this ripple effect. So I think getting close to the customer, it's really an important point, Yost, and I think that there's ways to do that. Bigger companies are able to put people on the street. They can run seminars. They can do web training and things of that nature. And smaller companies, what they need to do is make sure that their partner that they trust, who might be the distributor in Japan, who might be the distributor in parts of Asia or in parts of the European Union, that distributor on the ground speaking the local language is communicating the right message about your product, your service, and how to use the product in the way that they're going to get the most value out of it. Because once the customer doesn't see the value, it has a ripple effect back. Thanks for bringing that up. You had a question?
Could you talk a little bit about rev share when you're going through the distributor, when you have that close relationship with the customer, and then you overall the rev share with the distributor, OEM?
Yeah, that's one of these challenges that every company faces, because what you have is a relationship through distribution or channel partners, or even through OEMs. OEMs are very often more definable because there's more specific rules around OEMs, around how they will incorporate a new product and what they're going to pay. Let me explain. On distribution channels, is distribution or channel partners, an example of this would be, and I could use molecular wear again as an example. So we basically had direct sales, which we talked about earlier, right? We had an OEM partner, Applied Precision, that installed the software on their instruments. Every time they sold an instrument, we got a check in the mail. And then in parts of the world that we were just incapable of touching, right? We didn't know the language. We didn't have people on the street. We didn't have the financial resources to sell directly into places like Japan. We used a group there called CTC, and they were our distribution partner. And what we had to do is we had to give them a percentage of every dollar that they sold of the particular product. So it's a slightly different relationship. The OEM partners, it was a flat fee, is what we paid. There was no percentage. So essentially, the OEM partner would pay, pick a number, $10,000 every time they installed our software on an instrument. They'd pay that to us, and they kept the difference, whatever the difference was, if they charged service or if they charged training or anything else. It was very, very clean. So every time Microsoft or Intel has their product installed in a Dell computer, this Dell computer gets shipped out, Microsoft gets a flat check, a number, for every unit sold. Intel gets a check for every unit sold. It's very clean. And that's how it works typically with OEMs. Distribution is a whole different ballgame because what you're dealing with is salespeople that usually have lots of products in their bag. So if I use a distributor in Japan to sell my software to scientists in Japan, that sales rep doesn't work just for me. They work for a distributor. They probably have 6 or 10 company stuff in their bag. So when they go out to the offices of those companies, They're there to talk about the software for proteomics. They might be there to talk about a series of other things that are related to laboratory information management systems, databases. That might be the 4 or 5 products that they sell. I'm just one of them. So what you have to do is negotiate the profit margins on every unit that they sold. So it's a big balance. So essentially, if we would normally sell the software for $10,000 to the end user, we may not be getting that $10,000 anymore, pretty clearly, because now the CTC sales representative is selling to the end user for $10,000 and probably keeping 40% of that. And the $6,000 goes back to me. So that was essentially my cost of sale. So what you're negotiating is not a flat fee, because he could have sold it for $12,000 or he might have sold it for $9,000. You're typically negotiating a percentage of the total revenue. And every deal is slightly different. They're all in different shapes. But in my experience, usually in technology sales, OEM distributors are usually pretty clean. Every time we sell a unit of your product, software, app, you get a check. Distributors are a little bit messier, and very often you'll have a distributor in one part of the world that might be getting 40% off the retail price, and that's what they keep to pay their salespeople. And you might have a distributor in Europe that's getting 15% off the retail price. So it all depends on how you cut those particular deals. That's a great question. Any other questions before I jump ahead? How are we doing for time? Okay.
Just one comment on distribution. A key thing is to make sure that the sales reps are incented to sell yours. And so figuring out how to get them extra points towards the President's Club and all of that stuff becomes a constant thing you got to stay on top of.
That's a really good point. I guess that must be one of the new sections you're going to create for nuts and bolts is sales and marketing, because we could go into that discussion all day. How do you motivate people to actually push product and sell it? And it is a real challenge. You know, it's very easy when you control the sales force, right? So when we talked earlier, when I talked about direct sales, it's high contact, high control. I own that sales representative. It's a W-2 employee that works for me. They show up to my office or one of my other operations. I see them. I can control how they communicate in a very, very efficient way. And I can incentivize them by doing cool things, you know, with commission and salary and bonuses and sales trips or President's Club and these recognition things. When you get into distribution channels, it is very, very difficult to have a lot of control over those salespeople because they don't work for you. They don't report to you. They don't show up in your office. They don't send you emails. They have their own sales manager who works for the distributor. And quite frankly, salespeople will sell what's easy to sell. If they have 4 products in their bag and they're with a group of potential buyers, and one of those products continually becomes difficult to sell, either the message or the pricing is wrong, they will just put it aside and they'll stop carrying that particular product. So it's a real balance between incentivizing the sales representatives and also motivating the customers to be loyal. Other examples, we could beat this to death, but I don't want to turn this into a sales class. Obviously, when you ultimately get into building your business, you have to think about each of these in the same way. Think about it just the way that I broke it down here. What are the positives and negatives of each of those business models? If you said that we're going to sell retail, what are the positives and negatives of us selling through a retail channel? If we're going to sell through the internet, what are the positives and negatives of selling through that internet channel? And then also be very careful to look at those case studies of people within your segment. So if you were going to build the next great computer device that allowed for wireless connectivity of multiple devices and you wanted to sell that, you may say, I'm going to go retail and I'm going to buy shelf space at all the Best Buys. Or you may say, I'm just going to go on the internet and I'm going to sell and distribute this through the internet channel, and I'm going to rely on advertising to get eyeballs to look at my screen. You have to really think about that, and it has a lot to do with the segment that you chose. Are the people you're ultimately looking to sell to looking to buy that way? One of you guys used the great example of Nordstrom and Target. It just doesn't work because they were looking at a different way of targeting a customer that wasn't even aware of that particular brand. So I'm going to use a few very specific examples, and I'd love to get your feedback on these as we go through. And these are examples not dissimilar to what we've talked about, but really concrete examples that all of us are familiar with. How companies in the exact same market segmentation, same industry, chose radically different ways in order to get to the customer and to the end user. One certainly that we're all familiar with is Apple computers. So if you think about Apple and Dell, What are the big differences you can call out about those two products? And I see lots of Apples here, and I see a whole bunch of Dells as well. What are the primary differences? What is it?
Vertical integration.
Vertical integration. So explain that for people that might not know what that means.
So Apple owned the whole process from the software. They no longer are part of, they no longer, at one point they made processors, which they no longer do.
Yep.
But the design, fabrication, and distribution, so they can also control the channel, and they have their own retail network as well.
So it's a closed loop, essentially. It's a closed system, right? There's no sticker on the Apple computer that says Intel inside, right? Yep. They're not there to advertise for other people, right? They're not thinking about it that way. Versus Dell, that has a multi-integrated system that you would say would be multifaceted, where they're integrating multiple products in order to create the end product. And they've always been very transparent about that. One of the things that Dell did that was incredibly innovative, that the market was not, had never seen before, was that Dell allowed you to customize your computer. If you remember, this was novel. Nowadays, we take it for granted. We get online. We could order any computer. We could say, this is how much memory we want. I want a video chip. I want a, external hard drive, or I want an internal hard drive. I want a 17-inch screen or a 15-inch screen. Dell was the first to do this. And this wound up becoming a business model, a way to approach the market that had not been done before. And it allowed them to really dominate. They killed many of their competitors. Companies like Gateway and others, who were doing really well at the time, as a really strong PC player, got crushed because if I'm a business, I'm about to buy 8 new PCs for my sales reps. And I know that the most important thing on those PCs is memory, because our products take tons of storage. Or maybe the most important thing on those PCs is going to be video, high quality, high definition video, because when they go to a client site, they need to be able to show the product in a very robust way. I can customize my Dell computer very quickly to do that, and it's going to arrive to my specifications. And that was a very unique way of approaching a market that had actually been around for years. But Michael Dell's vision was, we're going to create a customized computer system. And we're going to be able to manufacture using the most cost-effective parts that we're able to bring into it. Citibank and American Express is another great example out there. And you can sort of substitute Citibank on this example for pretty much every other credit card. So I don't care if it's Citibank or it's Bank of America or it's Barclays or it's, just think of any MasterCard, Visa card that you have, and think about that for a moment against what you know about American Express. What are the big differences that you see there? There's a level of exclusivity.
Kind of, as a created a niche or brand, whoever buys that will associate with that high class.
Yeah, so it's considered a higher end brand. You really can't tell the differences between a MasterCard or a Visa, right? I mean, I bet if we all took all the credit cards out of our pocket right now, we would have a stack of MasterCards and Visas. And you really couldn't tell the difference. The only difference would be the color. Right? So this red one here is the Bank of America, and this black one's the Barclays. And this one's a Visa from Citibank, and this one's, there's no difference between those. What American Express did is they went into that marketplace, and they said, our business model is totally different. We're going to become a loyalty-built brand. We're going to have a prestige brand. We're going to they first created the charge card concept instead of the credit card, which is you paid it in full every month. And they've changed that quite a bit since then in order to sort of adapt to new buying habits. So as opposed to a credit card where you have a $5,000 limit and you pay off your minimum payment every month, they had a model where you pay off the whole thing every month, which created a higher level clientele. People that were they wanted to use it for convenience, but they didn't mind writing the check for $3,000 at the end of the month. They've since changed that because they've had to pivot with the marketplace. So they offer different types of cards. But what they did is they created a brand that people became very loyal to. What is the one thing that you notice about the color of American Express cards? Right? So everybody knows them. They're gold, platinum, black, or green. Right? The green card's like your entry-level card. After you've demonstrated loyalty, you've got better credit, higher income, you get the gold card, you get even better income, more success, more loyalty. You're then offered the platinum card. And for the very fortunate, if you're Paris Hilton or something, you get the black card. If you think about that model there alone, it is a visible sign, not only to you, but to everyone around you, that you have that gold card or you have that platinum card. It is something tangible, visual, that people can see that I've achieved this level of status. There is no MasterCard I could break out of my pocket that is even going to blink an eye. But if I had a black American Express card and broke that out, a lot of people would know what that was, or a platinum. What do they put on the front of the card that helps reinforce that loyalty? A member sense. No credit card does that. You get a credit card from American Express, a green card, when you're 22 years old in 2013. 10 years later, you're walking around with that platinum card in your pocket. It says member since 2013. How can you give up that card? You're never going to start at zero and give up that card. You are going to hold on to that thing until the day you die. You don't want that membership thing resetting back to zero. It creates this loyalty, and the beauty is they capture you. So you get the green card, it's virtually free. Every year, I couldn't even imagine, it's probably free or 29 bucks. You get the gold card, they charge you like $150 a year or something to keep for the privilege of keeping the card. You get the platinum card, it's $400 or $500 a year for the privilege of keeping that card in your wallet. And it comes with benefits, right? So you get a concierge number, you have a nice little book that shows up to your house, you get this very pretty magazine once a month. That level of loyalty has built American Express to be one of the most successful companies in the world. But if you stepped back, they're just a credit card company like everybody else. Their business model was fundamentally different. Jump ahead a little bit here. I mean, we could talk about airlines and other things all day long. I'll give you a few fun examples. So, coffee makers are one of the things. I don't even drink coffee, so I find coffee makers mystifying. Because I don't understand how coffee could taste better if it came out of a $1,500 coffee maker versus it came out of a $9.99 coffee maker I bought at CVS. But somehow people are convinced it must taste better. Because coffee makers are one of those great examples where the technology's been around forever. The workings of a coffee maker are pretty fundamentally simple. And the coffee makers sell from one end of the spectrum to the other. And the reason they're able to do that is because they market position and niche. So they think about their business model. So if you think about like regular coffee makers, you've got your standard coffee maker up here in the top left-hand corner. You buy for $15.99 at Sears. And you can step up to your $299 coffee maker. That's a pretty big jump. That better be really, really, really good coffee. But then you even think about how did these companies justify marketing it at an entirely different level. So Nespresso is probably one of those great examples where, who is familiar with Nespresso? All right. Who here owns a Nespresso? So why are we all familiar with Nespresso? It's because people became loyal or understood or became educated about that brand because they invested tens of millions of dollars to creating a very sexy image around that particular brand. Nobody does that in the coffee maker industry. Nespresso completely changed the paradigm. They said, we're not just going to make a coffee maker like Keurig and everybody else, or make a slightly more expensive coffee maker because it's got stainless steel on it. We're actually going to create a coffee maker that is a lifestyle investment. It is the equivalent of buying an appliance for your home. It is going to sit in your kitchen. You're not going to tuck it underneath the cabinet and close the door when you're done with your coffee. You're going to leave it on the counter for all your friends to see. And they were able to do that by having some of the most famous people in the world support their brand. They not only sell through the internet with the support of a tremendous advertising campaign, but they also sell through their own stores. You now see retail in very, very high-end malls, an entire Nespresso shop. It's kind of a mind-boggling concept. Many of you probably have seen this before. It's probably my favorite Nespresso commercial. And it's a great example of how a company who is selling a mundane product where if you went to a group of investors and said, hey, I'm thinking of building a coffee maker company, they would look at you like you were crazy. But Nespresso was able to take the world by storm by bringing a new image to coffee making.
And very lovely music. Dark. Very intense.
Balance.
Unique.
Mysterious.
An intense body.
Delicate and smooth. With strong character.
Right.
Rich. Very rich.
I would say Latin American temperament. Deep and sensual.
Yeah.
And a delicious aftertaste.
You're talking about Nespresso, right? Yeah. What else? Nespresso. What else?
Okay.
It's amazing, isn't it? Think about that value proposition. Try to go to a group of investors and say, I got an idea. We're going to create a new coffee maker. And I'm going to hire George Clooney to advertise it for me on TV. It's a mind-boggling proposition. It almost defies logic, which is why it worked. Nespresso right now is a massive organization with hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue and is producing some of the most beautiful looking coffee makers that people just leave them on their counter all the time. That's a fantastic way of thinking about business models. This was a market niche that never needed to be filled. Never. They weren't solving a big problem. They weren't saving babies. They weren't making data go faster over the internet. They weren't storing gigabits of information. They basically said, let's make coffee, but let's do it in a really cool way that we're going to actually become a brand. And I love using this example, especially on the back of the American Express example, because that's exactly what American Express did. We are going to become a lifestyle brand where no one is going to get rid of that card. They're going to keep this in their pocket for decades. And as long as we continue to serve them in a quality way, we keep them interested. When they get a little tired of green, we move them to gold. When their income goes up a little bit farther, we might go get them up to platinum. Toyota did it. They got loyalty in the brand. People loved Toyota. They're like, these things don't break. Especially at the time when Toyota came into the United States, American cars were junk. The things would break down all of the time. You could count on your American car being in the shop perpetually. The Japanese came into our market and just kicked our ass by building the best cars. The things were tanks. The thing would go forever. You drive around now, you see Japanese cars on the road today that have 250,000 miles on them. People are totally loyal. They are passed down through the family. So that loyalty, I don't want to drive a Toyota anymore. Guess what? I'm going to buy a Lexus. For the same price, I could buy a Mercedes. I could buy 3 or 4 other cars, but I chose that because I got loyal early. I got loyal real early. And American Express did that, and I think other groups are doing it as well. Watch companies, I'm going to wrap up here, Joe, because am I pretty much? Yeah, we're getting there. All right. Watch companies are another fantastic example of a market niche that probably never needed to be filled, not saving lives here, but recognize that as people grow, they change, they become wealthier, more successful, or they want to demonstrate different kinds of symbols, that watches are a fantastic way of doing it. And you can have your low-end watches where you buy your Timex for $29.99 or your Movado for $700, or you could have your super high-end watches. You've got these fantastic watch companies out there like IWC and Patek Philippe and others that they'll sell you a watch handmade. It took 2 craftsmen 365 days to build the watch. And they'll sell it for $50,000 or $60,000 for that single watch. And it's a totally different market approach than other watches that you might think are high-end. A great example of that is Rolex. So people associate Rolex with wealth, and it very much looks like a rich man's watch, right? Very often they're gold, they might be diamonds, they've got lots of noise. But can you imagine that you could buy 10 Rolex watches for the same price as the IWC watch on the right-hand side here that has a leather band? It is a handmade piece of jewelry. It'll be passed down for generations. And the only person that's going to know that it's this kind of watch are you and people just like you. That's it. Right? That's it. You put on a Rolex watch, man, the poorest guy on the street knows that's a Rolex watch, right? But you put on an IWC or a Patek Philippe, or you put on one of these fantastic, like a Piaget watch, the thing costs $70,000, $80,000. It looks like you could have paid $300 for it. It has a leather strap. But you know that that thing was built by hand. It'll be passed down for generations. It's like a Steinway piano. It plays just like a Baldwin. It plays just like a Yamaha. It looks just like it. But that thing was made by hand by craftsmen dating back for generations, and that will be an heirloom. So you will pay 10 times more for that. And that is the business model. So as you think about the products and services we all take for granted and the things that we live with every day, think about, they made a decision. It was a conscious decision that was made by that company, by those executives, by those founders, by those inventors, to target a specific part of the market in a specific way, and they had to stay true to that. And I'll sort of wrap up here, a little quick summary. Think about the value proposition. What gap are you filling, even if it's an unnecessarily filled gap? As we talked about with Nespresso, it might not be a gaping hole that the market's screaming for, but you might recognize that there's not a niche right now being filled. One of the examples I used a couple years ago was baby strollers. That was one of the fantastic things that, you see baby strollers, you go into a Kmart or a Walmart, you buy a baby stroller, or you see these new strollers that look like spacecrafts, right? What are they? These things are made of special alloy. They're like the kid sits up high in a funky position, like Bugaboo or something. I mean, you can spend $2,000 or $1,500 on a baby stroller. Now, I don't know how happy the baby is, but I bet the mom feels pretty cool walking down the street. That kid is just like, well, whatever. It's freaking cold out today. It's 17 degrees. The mom is like, look at me. I got that stroller, $1,700. Feeling good? But no one knows that that's an expensive baby stroller except for that mom and her friends. So that's just very fascinating when you think about, if I'm going to become a company competing in that marketplace, who am I competing with? And how do I target that mom or that dad or that individual consumer? And it's really important to think about that. And I'm going to wrap up here and say, really just thank you guys all for your time. This has been a blast.